All right. So picking up where we left off. So at a high level, we're talking about reviews and evaluation. And the very glib takeaway is it's hard. That doesn't mean it's impossible or that you don't try. It's just that it's hard. And we were talking about sort of the basic challenges of grading individual contributors, right? And a lot of it has to do with, making people better, delivering on the things that you sign up to do. Um, have your peers, peer assessment is really useful and so on and so forth. So grading a manager is a little harder, and it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, because I'm talking about getting people, I'm not talking about training directors up per se, right? Which is, you're a director and you're grading out a manager. But it's important to know how managers get graded when you take that first, manager role, even if it's a really junior manager kind of role. And there's a list that I probably should, pad out here in better detail. But things that you grade a manager on are sort of, minimizing surprise, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what you're trying to do. Like I always say that if I to describe my job in 2 words, it's minimize surprise. And that's, a topic we've covered over and over again. To some extent, you're being graded on retention, right? Like if your people are, constantly turning over, if you're, how good are you at hiring, whatever. So, basically, all the other stuff we're talking about here, right? Which means, how do you sort of assess those things? And again, the higher you go in the food chain, the more sort of squishy it can be. But I don't know how to quantize it, but like basically, in the Lacuna context, which is like a lot of others, there's sort of this general sense of sort of meets expectations, exceed expectations, is failing to meet expectations, and is just sucking, right? And so those are usually not too hard to sort of reach a consensus on among, your sort of peers. We're not going to spend a ton of time on that. But it does connect right into sort of that it's harder to measure your own output, right? Like one of the most unnerving things I found from going to an IC to a leadership role is like, okay, what am I doing? Like, how do I know if things are going well? Like, what's my output, right? Like at the end of the day, what do I do? Is it a Gantt chart that's going to end up, in the trash at the end of the week? Is it, am I getting graded on sitting in meetings? Like, how does that even work? And it's just a thing you have to learn to live with, is that you have, after presumably the first, entire section of your career of having like very tangible output in terms of, oh, I wrote that code, or I fixed that bug, or I got that into production, or whatever. Now you're like, well, the people around me are doing that, so that's probably good, right? And it's true that that enabling that stuff is somewhat difficult to measure, but also, it's not that hard to develop that sort of, finger touch for like, you have a sense of whether or not you're contributing to people's productivity, or hindering it, right? Like if you're micromanaging people and they're, showing up to work late because they're demotivated or whatever, or they're, complaining to your boss about how, they don't feel like they're being just respected, or they don't feel like they're being given adequate input or whatever, mostly you're just listening, right? You're listening to what people say they need, and you're going, assuming that you agree with that with those needs, plus or minus, like, oh, my tickets aren't, don't have enough specificity, or the QA team is letting shitty code into production. Oops, that was kind of my fault, I guess. Like whatever it is, you're you're looking at the productivity of the team, and that should be a reflection on whether or not the manager is being effective or not. So, creating the conditions for getting work done. But also I really like having skip level one-on-ones. So, Wei did this a lot. Like Wei was talking to y'all all the time, even if you didn't necessarily report directly to her. And that was really useful for me. And the feedback I got was pretty filtered. Like sometimes, there was one person who was pretty upset with me about something that wasn't super fair necessarily, but they went to Wei and it's like, oh, Marie is failing me, as a manager because reasons. And Wei, listened to that and said, uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. And then kind of came back to me and was like, somebody's projecting their own shit onto you. And I'm like, yeah, it happens. It's okay. And I'm like, do you see a problem? And Wei's like, nope, I don't see a problem at all. I think this person is just struggling right now. I'm like, okay, good, thanks. Even if the feedback wasn't directly actionable, Wei's skip level one-on-one gave this other person an outlet, to talk about, how they felt. And they were having a rough time, and it wasn't all that much to do with me, but they still needed an outlet. But there are a lot of things, if you're in the position of a leadership role, what are you going to measure sort of in your direct reports, right? And I don't know exactly how to merge sort of section A and section D, but there's things that you want to learn, how to measure with sort of the best accuracy you can, right? And this is reflected in, one-on-ones or whatever OKRs or whatever structure you're using to sort of, track people's goals and accomplishments or whatever. So, there's deliverables. And, you want to find that sweet spot, where you have as much speed and accuracy as possible. Like there's no point turning in work, calling it done, when it really isn't done, or if it's half baked or whatever, right? So like, being clear on the definition of done is really important. Done includes, code coverage, for example, in most places. When I was, like at O&I or PacBio, we didn't really do all that much stuff. We relied on the QA team to do a lot of the testing. We didn't have exhaustive test harnesses, and we didn't have code coverage metrics. Like I wanted that stuff, but the company was like, oh, no, we have to test it on the machine anyway, so we'll just test it on the machine. Okay. Estimation ability is important. And it's something that you can work around and facilitate, right? Like if someone's consistently overestimating or underestimating, you can just go in and put it that fudge factor. Ideally, you don't want to be the one doing this. And maybe it's the technical program manager, whoever like owns the schedule. If it's not you, might be doing that. But having a real sense of where people are on their ability to estimate and their sort of consistency with it. Some people are just wildly all over the place, and they're pretty tedious. And that's where you want to pair them up with someone who's pretty good at estimating and sort of, have the person A train up person B, if possibly above and beyond what you can do, since you're no longer presumably a really great domain expert, right? Like the further you get into leadership, the less you're sort of like keeping up your developer chops, and the less you're keeping up your developer chops, the more you're going to rely on, so your trusted developers to, provide the deep technical knowledge that you're going to need to be able to make good decisions, but also to teach people and mentor people. So commitment is important, right? Like, you can use commitment as a cudgel to extract work out of hourly workers. But sometimes, the company has real hard and fast goals, and, we have to hit a deadline on this day, or the investors are going to balk, or the customers are going to be enraged, or whatever it is. And, there's this line to be walked between like, okay, are you just exploiting hourly workers? Or is this we really need you to bust your butt for, 6 days a week for a quarter in order to meet this goal, or we're all going home. And it's also legit for some people to go, I didn't sign up for that, or I can't do that, or I have a family or whatever. And so, you should be pretty thoughtful about what you ask of people. It really helps to know sort of where people are at. And because if you ask them, especially somebody that's relatively important, like someone that's been there for a long time or has a very specific type of domain knowledge, you have to balance this is a really important goal against, hey, this person's probably really good and could go get another job if we ask them to do something that they just can't do in good conscience, right? Whether it's depriving, their partner or their kids, or, some other commitments or what have you. So commitment's important, and it needs to be in, everybody's sort of personal context.
Real quick, how do you kind of navigate the overlap of estimation and commitments? And like, where do you draw boundaries between this is how long we think it will take, but it's not a hard, fast commitment in some cases?
Right.
So I've seen a lot of times like it leads people to sandbag commitments and say this is going to take 3 times longer than it actually is, so we don't get stuck on the hook for it type of thing.
So the way I build schedules to accommodate that is I always tell people estimates are not commitments, full stop. Like there's a line that is firm and fixed. Having said that, the way you build commitments in is say that we have to reach this by this certain time. We're going to look at the estimates, right? And if the estimates are tight, then we can't in good conscience put any sort of faith in the commitment, right? So you always have to have the organization do the padding, don't have the individuals do the padding. That's the way I think about it. So, do all your estimates and then add, whatever, like, so another thing too, is when you're asking people to do estimates, right? You want to ask estimates, you need to have one other input. An estimate always needs to come with a confidence value, right? So if I ask you, Carter, how long is it going to take to, build this widget? And you kind of, think about it for a minute, like, well, there's a 50-50 chance I'll have it done in a week. There's an 85% chance I'll have it done in 2 weeks. And there's a 99.9% chance I'll have it done in 3 weeks, right? Those are really useful numbers, right? So if I was looking to make a commitment, right, I'd be like, okay, how vitally important it is for this thing to happen, right? For that, if it's like it will kill the company, then I'm kind of going to ask for, I'm going to ask for what the, 85th percentile estimate is. And I'm going to ask for what the 99th percentile estimate is, so that I can build in that case where there's some really hard and fast thing. I'm going to build out of 99s, and I'm going to track people's sort of expectations at 85 and allow for slippages. So, and if you're building a crucial schedule with 50th percentile estimates, you're screwed, right? Or you're exploitive. And if you're exploitive, then you might win the battle, but you're going to lose the war because people are going to get burnt out, or they're just going to quit, right? Or both. So that's how I think about that. Other things that are interesting and useful are, innovation. I think we did a fair amount of that at Lacuna, like, people thinking outside the box, particularly like on the research team. It varies. You're maybe not looking as much at DevOps, as a source of innovation, but then maybe you are. I mean, all these, everything in computer science and engineering is changing. So that's sort of scanning the horizon for new things to bring in. You don't, like, this is a conversation we had with Seth back in the day, and he's like, yeah, well, I think people spend way too much time on that stuff. I'm like, well, there's a balance, right? The amount of time to be spent looking for sort of systemic improvements, whether it's, a language or a tool chain or whatever, right? If it's zero, then somebody eventually is going to outcompete you based on whatever the latest hotness is. And if that's all you're doing all the time, you're basically just playing with toys and never delivering anything. So you got to find that balance, right? And that's kind of one of those, everybody looks at each other and says, okay, well, how do we feel about the state of the world right now? Do we feel like we're going to need to innovate our way out of this? Or is the innovation going to happen somewhere else? And we're just like turning the crank and we have everything we need to turn that crank to meet those deadlines. In that case, I would be looking for gaps in projects. You hit a big delivery and then you tell people, okay, everybody can just fuck off for 2 weeks and go play with, toys or, software toys, what have you. So, technical ability, obviously super important. And, in all by itself, it's not enough, right? You can have somebody that's really technically capable, but if they can't get along with people or they, fight with product or whatever, there's a real limitation as to how valuable it is. It's all about, sort of the context. What's the environment where a bunch of people are going to build and release and support and mature, a set of, tools or technologies, right? Like, that sort of technical ability needs to express itself in teaching others and leadership. I thought Michael Durling was really good at that. He talked about, his decision process. I felt he was a pretty good teacher and so on and so forth. You got code reviews, team support, culture values, communication, all that stuff. And I kind of looking at this like, maybe I should come back and try to like merge these two, because I feel like there's a bit of redundancy here, but each of these things is squishy, right? Like you can't take a test and get an A or B or C, right? This is, you're watching the way your team interacts with each other, how they're treating you, how they're treating other teams, especially, right? Like if I see somebody being shitty to QA because they think they got some sort of superiority complex, I will come down on that like a fucking freight train. Because I will not have that in any org where I'm at. QA people are worth their freaking weight in gold, and I, stand by that 100%. And similarly, the people like Nancy who did a lot of the schedule wrangling, product, their role is crucial, right? Like just because software developers make decent money doesn't mean you're any better than anybody else. It just means that your skills are in the supply and demand is what it is. So I think probably the hardest thing to measure is communication. Like how do you grade that out? I mean, certainly you're looking for sort of politeness, you're looking for not talking too much, being a good listener, communicating clearly, right? Like don't obfuscate what you're trying to say, and don't approach subjects too sideways. Sometimes you have to soften communication to not trigger people or be mean about it or whatever, but that's a whole set of squishy things. And then lastly, when you're talking about like getting ready for performance review, just like however it is you're doing your sort of recurring planning, whether it's A's and O's, OKRs, whatever it is, right? Tell people what you're going to grade them on, and then take notes the whole time, so that when you get to these intervals where you're going to sit down and have those conversations. Now, obviously, you're not going to wait until the end of the quarter to say, oh, I saw you fuck up 3 weeks ago. You should say that in the moment, right? But also write it down so that you won't forget about it at review time. It's sort of the overall, package of whatever your cycle is, 6 months, a year, what have you. Okay. It's a lot of words. I feel like it's some redundancy in there, but let's put a pin in reviews and evaluation. Any other questions, comments? Okie dokie. This is tough. Conflict management. I think a lot of us shy away from conflict. Most of the people I know in tech broadly, and like software and QA and design, like they're not like naturally conflict seekers, but it does happen, right? And when you do have someone that is a source of conflict or whatever, you're often dealing with people that are just uncomfortable with it. I mean, God knows I was really conflict averse for the longest time, and I still don't enjoy it, but I've had to learn how to use that sort of sensor, right? That sort of uncomfortable feeling in my gut. I don't use it to steer away from whatever it is. I now use it to steer into whatever it is, because it's probably a sign that this is the thing that really merits your attention. And, when you're an IC, you might find yourself in conflict with, somebody in some other part of the org. And if you can't work it out, then what? You go to your boss or their boss or something, right? But what happens when you're that boss, right? And you have to adjudicate that. So conflict can be in any of the sort of the directions, right? You can have a conflict with your boss, you can have a conflict with one of your reports, you can have a conflict with one of your peers, and that's your own conflicts. Identifying sources of conflict can be useful for sort of heading things off at the pass, but also bringing that into any sort of situation where you need to do sort of amelioration and resolution, either on your own behalf or on behalf of two people, somewhere in the org that you have some amount of influence over, formal or otherwise, right? So, there's some principles here, like, you want to assume goodwill, but not everybody is arguing in good faith, right? Some people have ulterior motives. I'm hard pressed to come up with like a really specific example right now. I'm going to make a note here. Sometimes conflicts come down to sort of personalities. I've seen people who are like really optimistic get into sort of consistent, arguments with people who are, very pessimistic or whatever. I've seen, extroverts drive introverts crazy and so on and so forth. So just sort of watching people's sort of natural tendencies and building that sort of mental model of who they are and what's likely to like be hard for them to deal with, what's going to be uncomfortable for them, what's going to be, the stone in the shoe, from that peer or the other one. Like I worked with this guy, Nate, at, I don't know if Neil and Carter, you remember Nate from the San Mateo office. He he had this tendency when he would get frustrated with the whatever he was working on, he would just like shout expletives, right? Like he'd get really angry and like just spray it all over the office. And that's just kind of who he was, right? Like he was a very expressive, unfiltered individual. But boy, was it uncomfortable for people who are like trying to head down to work. And then the guy like sitting this far away from him said, "Son of a bitch, not," like Nate, like, stop doing that. It wasn't Nate, like arguing a technical point. It wasn't Nate to like trying to be mean. It wasn't anything other than just kind of who Nate was. And he still needed to rein it in, right? Aesthetics. Yeah, Nate also had a thing with like nasty, like his feet always smelled really bad. But the aesthetics isn't about personal hygiene necessarily. It can be about like, minimalist versus, maximalist or whatever. I know that like sometimes engineers will have opinions about, design work. And if they're going to implement something, they're going to have, potential fights with sort of, people in product. And, a good way to manage that is to be like, okay, well, ultimately, whose responsibility is it, right? This is a go round I had, not to throw Seth under the bus, but this was a go round I had with Seth, is that, he would get something from like Nelson and be like, what? This is totally the wrong way to do that. I'm like, make your case. And if it's not working out, right? Like you're just going to have to kind of suck it up and move on, because ultimately it's your job to write the code and it's his job to do the design, and you're not going to get beat up. Like, yeah, but I'm like, Seth, there's no but. I think he kind of came around. I certainly heard much less about it from him. I don't think he was happy about it, but like, what are you going to do? Assumptions can be a real source of conflict, right? Like if you assume that somebody else is going to do something and they're assuming that you're going to do it, right? That turns into a real mess. So being clear on like, responsibilities, it's sort of adjacent to miscommunication. Some people are just arrogant, like who do I have as an example of that? Actually, we didn't have that problem that I can think of at Lacuna. I don't have a great example at Zipcar. But I've met people that are just so damn full of themselves. And I might have been that way when I was, in my 20s. But they kind of run roughshod over people. They maybe treat juniors with, sort of a unprofessional level of respect or whatever, and also some people are just real fucking stubborn. This was one of the things that like I struggled with again, not to throw Seth under the bus, but like guy was pretty freaking stubborn. Like you got him launched onto a thing and like he wouldn't do that sort of disagree and commit thing. Like it would just keep coming up over and over and over. And I can finally, like in our one-on-ones, I'm like, Seth, disagree and commit, disagree and commit, disagree and commit. say it, say the words. And it took a while to get there. And how do you get people out of these conflicts, right? Well, you have to find out, like, is this a hill they're really willing to die on, and why, right? If it's not a hill they're willing to die on, then you need to get them to sort of, you gotta hold up that mirror and get them to say like, okay, yeah, I'm kind of being fussy about this thing or whatever, but ultimately, if it's hindering my relationships with my peers, if it's hindering my career, if it's hindering my effectiveness or whatever, right? You want to tie it back to what somebody's sort of goals and values are, right? Like, is your goal to be right, or is your goal to be effective? Is your goal to have is it more important to like have the code formatted the way you like it? Or is it more important that everybody uses coding standards? I mean, like things that to some extent sound like kind of no-brainers, they're not always. And I've seen these things come up over and over again, over however many years I've been leadering. So also, when we talk about sources, right, sometimes you can get sort of, caught up in the symptoms and not the root cause, right? So like sometimes when people are, just as an example, blustery and sort of try to like tell everybody how it is, even if they're not really in the best position to do so, or they don't have the deepest experience, sometimes it's really rooted in a profound insecurity, right? And creating psychological safety is really important because people need to admit when they're wrong. People need to see when they're wrong. They need to not double and triple and quadruple down, when they're wrong, because they're afraid of having to admit that they were wrong about something. So everything that the organization that can do, everything you can do, everything you can get their peers to do, to make it okay to be wrong, being wrong, admitting being wrong is the path to being right. And none of us is going to be right about everything all the time. You know, I got a face full of feedback today on, you know, well, these are your growth opportunities. And like, you know, if I was resistant to that feedback, then that's just a really bad sign in terms of, you know, well, what do you want, right? Like if you say you want this thing, but you're willing to screw up your application process or, you know, scare off a potential boss, manager, whatever, a hiring manager, you know, you constantly be connecting people's values back. But understanding those root causes, like it's not always going to be your responsibility, but you might say, well, I'm not understanding here why this is so important to you. Like why is this a hill that you're going to die on? Whatever. And like, if you ask me questions like that, I'd be like, you know, if I was like, you know, being stubborn about something, right? You know, I would need to do some introspection and go try to find out, oh, okay, why am I this way? And, you know, hopefully that's a thing, you know, not everybody's in therapy, but hopefully everybody's had a little bit of it here and there, or at least has the self-awareness to know, oh, there was this one time when, you know, I was afraid of this, or one time when this really bad thing happened or whatever. And I'm carrying this scar tissue, these traumas into these situations, and I get really triggered. And so, you know, that's where you can start, like, once you get that sort of insight, it's like, oh, well, let's think about not putting you in positions where you feel, say, put on the spot and forced to make a decision, you know, in real time in front of your peers, that you need time to think about it. Or let's talk about, like, you feel like you have incredible informal responsibility, but you don't have any formal authority. Like that can be really uncomfortable when people expect a lot of you, but you don't have the tools or the authority to, like, you know, get it done, whether it's, you know, resources or other people or whatever. And I guess another way to saying that is the stated reason, you know, the real reason for the conflict. What you're looking for is patterns, right? If you're seeing someone show up with, like, you know, these types of conflicts on a recurring basis, you want to get down to the root cause, if at all possible. And it's not always possible. And even if you understand what the root cause is, you can't always fix it. But looking for patterns and addressing the patterns and not playing whack-a-mole with symptoms, you know, it's a good idea in medicine. It's a good idea in leadership.
For you here. Yeah, no.
You had a question?
Yeah, I had a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, cool. In these situations where you have conflict and you know, okay, this is the real reason, how important is it to be honest versus diplomatic?
Well, that is a fine line. It really depends on sort of the nature of it. And this is where understanding the person really well is important. If you think you've got somebody who's like kind of very hair trigger, I would err towards diplomatic. If you've got someone that you know is really receptive to feedback and they're not going to flip out, you kind of have to find that line, that balance of, like, okay, knowing this person the way I do, can I give them this feedback in this style and have them flip out? Or are they going to go, oh yeah, no, you're totally right. You know, like I was definitely not super receptive to feedback for a good 10 years earlier in my career. And it was just really hard. And, you know, people realized that, and they would not give me feedback because they knew I was like twitchy. And if they did, they would sort of, you know, sort of pussyfoot around it. Like where the biggest growth opportunities that I've had are where people I trust just fucking punch me in the face. Now, I don't recommend that as sort of a general purpose strategy, but like judging when to go in delicate versus, you know, firm all the way over to sort of guns a-blazing, you know, that's a thing that develops, you know, over time. The more feedback you give, the more you're going to get good at giving feedback and tuning that feedback. And again, one size does not fit all, and delivering the feedback in the way that it's most likely to cause change, that's what you're aiming for. Are you going to always hit it? No. I mean, you got to practice, and even once you've practiced a lot, you can make mistakes. So, you know, express your best intentions and apologize where necessary. And it's possible to undershoot. Like, definitely, there were a couple times at Lacuna where I did not make myself sufficiently blunt in giving feedback, and it took several iterations to get there. So like, you can overshoot and you can undershoot. Make your best guess, calibrate, correct, try to get to the optimum, you know, level of intensity. Make sense? Okay. You know, sometimes people have, you know, diverging motivations, right? And those are important to root out. So just an example of like, you know, Seth versus product or whatever, right? You know, his motivation in, you know, telling people that they were, you know, in his opinion that they were doing it wrong, was that, as explained to me, he was worried that like bad decisions were going to get made and then he would have to clean up the mess. And this was his argument for, oh, I should be in leadership because then I would, you know, since I wouldn't have to be the IC cleaning up the mess, I care less about other people making bad decisions. And I'm like, can you even hear yourself? Like, you're totally not winning me over here, my dude. Like, I really shouldn't be throwing Seth under the bus. I'll have to like, you know, figure out how to edit this out. And, you know, Seth, if you're ever watching this, I learned a lot from you and I hope you learned a lot from me. Take care. But when you find those divergent motivations between two people, sometimes you just have to make a call, right? And that's where, you know, I will fall back at times to the sort of who's ultimately in charge of this, right? It doesn't really matter what you think about how the stuff is laid out, because that's not what you're going to get graded on. It's not what your responsibilities are. Ultimately, what the product looks like and how it behaves, yeah, have an opinion, offer your suggestions, and so on and so forth. But ultimately there's the, you know, who's fundamentally responsible for it. And sometimes you just have to get people to like this. It's not appropriate to keep trying to re-adjudicate this and belabor it and so on and so forth. Okay. So how do you recover from a situation where you have been in conflict or are in conflict, or you're mediating other people that are conflict? Oh shit. Oh, hi, Seth. So some of the guidelines I have, and I really need to add more stuff here. You know, sort of inviting listening and curiosity, right? Like, don't get so locked in a position to where your ears stop working and, you know, you stop giving a crap about what the other person thinks. I mean, sometimes that's hard. You know, but like model that behavior as well, right? Like be more inclined to ask questions than make pronouncements. Also, like if you see somebody getting riled up, right? Like sometimes you're like, haha, you know, I can rile this person up and then they'll make some terrible mistake and then I will win. That's actually, that's a really risky gambit. So if you see somebody that's getting upset about something, like figure out when the emotions are getting too high and just pull the plug and say, we're going to come back to this later, you know, or in yourself too. I've definitely found those situations where it's like, okay, I can feel myself coming up. I'm going to say or do something that I will regret if I keep going down this path. So I'm going to back out too. Looking for common goals and common ground is really important because, you know, conflict often sort of damages mutual social capital. You feel like, you know, you find yourself in you know, somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose situation. You want to foster as much sort of, you know, win-win goodwill. And, you know, look for the points of commonality, right? Oh, this is a terrible example, but, you know, that Pina Colada song, right? Like the guy and the gal thought they didn't have anything in common or whatever. And like, so they went off looking to have their needs met. And they, you know, there's this ad in the paper and it turns out, oh, I didn't even know all that stuff about you, right? So that just popped into my head. So looking for those, like, well, what do we agree on? Like, enumerating the things that we do agree on and using potentially those points of agreement as sort of the foundation for coming to some sort of solution in the middle, so on and so forth. I don't remember what I meant by thick versus thin skin. I mean, like, you know, obviously thin skin is people that get triggered easily and thick is not. You know, the further you go up the ladder, the thicker your skin needs to be professionally, even if like you're by nature, you're sort of a thin skinned or like, you know, easily triggered person, like that's your problem, chief. And you need to figure out how to manage it. And you need to communicate to people when, you're being pushed past your limits, even when it's uncomfortable to do so. You're making yourself vulnerable, and that also will earn respect from people. Staying objective sometimes is really hard, right? Like there's the when somebody's making an argument to you, they might make a lot of sort of adjacent arguments that like aren't necessarily relevant. They've got their biases. They probably are aware of your biases, your sympathies. And they will play on them if they think it's to their advantage to do so. So like staying sort of as objective as you can in any sort of heat of the moment is really important. And recognizing, again, when your emotions start coming up, right, that's when your ability to reason starts to fall off. And that's where you might want to tap out and say, I need some time to think this over. I need to take a walk around the building. I need a drink of water, whatever it is. Stay in touch with your own biases so that you're aware when you might be leaning too much in one direction because it's more comfortable. Try to stay in that sort of, Zen place. I used to get in this, I had this argument back in the day with when I was reporting at PacBio to this guy, Kevin Corcoran. I've mentioned him a few times probably. And, and I would get really riled up about stuff, and I would let everybody know that I was riled up about whatever it was. And he's like, you got to just like tone that shit down. I'm like, but like, I don't know if I can do my job if I don't get to bring my passion to the office, right? Like quality comes from caring about things. And if you're telling me I'm not allowed to care about things, he's like, stop that. I'm not telling you not to care. I'm telling you to control your expression of that caring. Call it dispassionate passion, right? Like be as passionate as you want, just like don't broadcast it. There's no need to do that. And so that was, that was an idea that took me a while to sort of wrap my brain around, is that, when people were staying cool and calm, it didn't mean they didn't care. It didn't mean they weren't upset. It just meant that they knew that the way they presented themselves in the situation as calm or reasoned was the best way to get to a good solution, or at least to, take a heated moment and diffuse it or whatever. So, and also, collect feed, like the skip level one-on-ones, I think is really important. But also creating an environment where your one-on-ones, where your direct reports can tell you sort of how they think their peers are doing, how they think you're doing. And, in all of these areas, but particularly in sort of, mitigating and managing conflicts. Because, when people see situations with winners and losers, they're going to start figuring, well, I don't want to be a loser. So I'm going to figure out like, how to, engineer wins wherever possible. And so you're looking for opportunities to like diffuse that and not create an environment where people are seeing a lot of zero-sum behaviors, right? You want to turn whatever the opposite of zero-sum is. You want to like minimize, winners and losers, and foster collaboration and co-winning and whatever. And it's not always possible. I don't want to like sugarcoat it or pretend that there's a fairyland where everybody gets along all the time for all reasons. Okay. I think chapter 28 is like one of my fuzzier ones, but I know there's a lot in here. I don't know how well I expressed all that. I'm hoping some of that, came across as being useful. Questions, comments? All right.
One of the things that I would like to know is, how do you like deal with not only like, obviously you've spoken about thin skin versus thick skin people, but like if say somebody is thin skinned, they make a mistake, they do something in an emotional way, but you see them evolve. How do they like get themselves out of that niche, or get like, because it's happened to me where I have been put as, like this special needs kind of need this kind of feedback kind of person, but I just didn't know better. And then I evolved past that, but then I was still known as that. So
well, yeah, changing your reputation is one of the hardest things. which is why, like it's really important when you go into a job, that first 30, 60, 90 days is so crucial for sort of tone setting. But like when you do mess up and you do develop something of reputation. So like at PacBio, I was a junior manager and a reasonably competent IC before that. And I blew it. I almost got fired. And, they didn't fire me and I had to figure out what to do. But I basically had to just be really thoughtful about what were the things that I was doing to give me that reputation. And then not just like stop doing those things, but like actively demonstrate wherever possible that that wasn't who I was anymore. And that included talking to people about it and asking specifically, like, I have this sort of tendency to behave in this fashion. Are you seeing that at all? Like foreground what it is that you're trying to develop or learn. Like if you got this, how would you describe it? That you were a little bit thin-skinned? Like, yeah, I have it past, been a little thin-skinned, but like, are you seeing that from me now? Are you seeing any sort of hints of that? Do you feel like I've got a thin coat of paint, but it's just below the surface? Or like, are you seeing like do you think you're seeing a real change? And if not, why not? Right? Like foregrounding it to like signal to people, I'm self-aware and I'm actively trying to change, right? That's going to move the needle faster than just performing better and hoping people notice, right? Like leaning into that of like, everybody has their areas of growth and just kind of wearing that on your sleeve. I mean, don't go like broadcast at a company meeting or whatever, and don't open up every conversation with, well, I know I suck, but I'm trying to suck less, right? When it comes up, when it makes sense to talk about it, whether it's with your boss, like particularly with your boss, right? Like you should be able to say anything with your manager in the one-on-ones, right? And I always say when I'm in a one-on-one, what can I be doing better? What do I need to be doing more of, less of, or keep doing what I'm doing, right? Kind of like the retros, right? Like a weekly one-on-one should be, a little itty bitty retro, and maybe it's only 30 seconds of talking about it. But it might be like, oh, everything's good. Or it might be like, well, I saw this thing or I saw that thing or whatever. So does that make sense?
Yep. It does.
Like acknowledge the problem, strive to be like really good at addressing the problem, and ask people, am I addressing the problem? So that's my way to address that. All right. I think I can blast through 29 here in the remaining 12-ish minutes. So, one of the first questions I ask anybody that's applying for.
You go, I have to drop because I have a call at 12 that I need to prep for.
Okay. Well, this would be a good quiet place to stop then. We'll pick up 29 next time. So let's see. Today is 3 August. And we're finishing up here. Okay. So yeah, we'll just kill it a couple minutes early. So
Sweet.
Did you get your offer, Marie?
I did.
Congratulations.
It's a verbal offer and I verbally accepted, and I'm expecting a PDF sometime today.
Great.
I don't want to count my chickens, and I'm not like broadcasting it. But and I actually got 2 offers on my house yesterday, and we accepted one of them.
Oh, nice.
That's moving into contract as well, I hope. The folks said that they would be able to put down their 3% earnest money within 24 hours. So
That's great.
that's like, until they put in their earnest money, they can walk away, and basically have no penalties. So anyway, whatever, you probably know that. I'm gonna have to go trim all of that from the video because none of that's relevant. Stop it.